I have tried to craft my my speech to Ed's title. So if it seems to meander, it was just because of the title. It was trying to actually fulfill the assignment. And I have never actually given a speech on, hang on, finance, leverage, impact, 3 keys to social change. So if I go off topic, somebody can tell me to get back on. It's fine with me. You know, finance and social change, I think, are really, you know, you put them in the same. Yes.
Could you please speak a little louder?
I might have to get professional help here because I know I have a tendency to swallow my words, but this is not actually. I will attempt to actually project, and maybe I'll look in my water bottle and not look down at my notes so much. That might help. So is that better?
Well, and you all, please come up. I mean, anyone who wants to hear it better, we'll work it out amongst ourselves. So we've got some chairs up here, so come on up.
I can also do this. I don't want to, you know, well, maybe I don't. It's too awkward. I'll focus. Good grief.
You brought Jimi Hendrix with us.
Always. We're going on a trip to outer space now. Let's see. Is there a...
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm just going to press on. You know, I mean, finance and social change, of course, are uneasy partners. Sometimes unwilling partners. And the people in finance say, hey, wait a minute. I'm here to make money. You know, move over, honey, we're driving. And the people on the social side say, we don't want to be encumbered by all this silliness about money. We really just want to do our good work. Please go away and do your greedy, awful work so, you know, we can just get on with it. And we tend to think in a weird way that despite side activities, commerce is kind of immune to social impact. And on the other side, social activities are strangely partitioned from financial leverage. Is that better? Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you. I'm going to actually then do this. That must be flawless. Now, in case I start wandering around the room picking on people. Okay. Is that better? Yeah, I can feel that that's much better. I can actually hear myself now. Some bad things. But you know, the world has changed. Things are not quite as sort of fun and partitioned as they used to be. There's a lot of bleeding from one area to the world into another, and what used to be sort of finance has now become social, and vice versa. And we see a lot of cozy assumptions upended. Things that we used to depend on, like a reliable job or the change of seasons or alternative authoritative information. Recently, even Big Bird is being called into question. And so the very, you know, basic, you know, social tenets of our society are being threatened or shaken, at least changed, as is finance. And they're sort of feeding off one another. And recently, and these are sort of early pieces of the puzzle, some rather unlikely entrants into the social arena have come over. You know, J.P. Morgan Social Impact Award. Goldman Sachs Gibbs. You notice that the Gibbs is in very kind of lighter type than the Goldman Sachs part. But at any rate, you know, there is some, you know, there's some blurring of the lines, one might say. And the most unlikely folks are kind of acting social. Impact, in the words of business, and social impact in particular, is less and less an externality of the business, and because of risk factors, is becoming more and more internal to the business. And similarly, for the nonprofit world, understanding finance and how to do enterprise finance and wield money intelligently is becoming prerequisite to having social impact. It's not just It's not sort of something you do at the end of the year with your eyes closed, which was the way I used to do it back 30 years ago. So I'm going to talk today about seeking wisdom about how money and mission, how social impact and finance work together or don't work together. And I'm going to look at it through the lens of the foundation I now lead. I've only been there a little over a year. When I came, it was a very somewhat different place. And for those of you who don't know what a private foundation's business model is, it's basically that a wealthy, usually a very wealthy individual, leaves a large amount of money with some social benefit in mind. It is invested in conventional investments, typically, and that, based on IRS rules, 5% of that is then given out in grants for good causes. And that's how private foundations operate. So there's a very bright line between the investment side and the giving side, between as it were, the finance side and the social side. Even though the people on the social side are wielding money as a tool and the people on the finance side are not. That's typical. That's not universal, and there's been a tremendous amount of foment for years and years of people on the finance side or people who are doing more of what's called program-related and mission-related investment from the investment side, doing more of that. So that's part of the picture here. The F.B. Heron Foundation, I should say, is not a typical foundation. Long before I arrived, as Ed said, it's entrepreneurial. It had done a lot of mission-related investment with its endowment, which is different from with its grant budget. Most program-related investments are made from the grant side of a foundation. The Heron Foundation, when I arrived, had 40% of its endowment in mission-related investments. That was across the entire range of instruments, from loans to loan funds, private equity, public companies that are screened, and then unscreened public companies. So that's the 60%, right? Or negatively screened for bad behavior kinds of things. The foundation's mission was to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty. We were saying to ourselves when I came on, and our dominant strategy was asset acquisition and access to either capital or opportunity, with the idea that was a reliable pathway up for people pulling themselves out of poverty, and long-standing. So, when I came on as the new foundation president, I uttered the 13 words most terrifying in the field to nonprofit organizations, which were, we have a new president, and we're going to start strategic planning. And of course, we immediately got a consultant. This was our consultant. She's now running an international division of McKinsey, so it's pretty amazing. And we had to ask ourselves, is our mission still relevant? Helping people in communities help themselves out of poverty, is that relevant in this day and time? Well, sadly, far more poverty now than when we set up shop. Deeply relevant. Not a whole heck of a lot of progress, sad to say. And we didn't actually, I was kidding, she wasn't really with McKinsey. She was my grandmother. No, my grandmother needs a job now, as you know, as a retiree. We really didn't need anybody to tell us that our mission was still relevant and that we were failing. And so we said to ourselves, gee, maybe we should re-examine some of our assumptions. One thing that was pretty clear to us was that a lot of the asset-based and access-based strategy rely on reliable opportunity and rely on a post-war narrative where there is an ever-expanding economy that provides more for all, and and that home ownership, you know, and all of those kinds of things are premised on a world that has changed, and that in fact the reliable opportunity that those programs and that programmatic approach relies on had given way to much more reliable state of volatility in the economy. And that if we were going to be successful doing what we needed to do, we needed to acknowledge that at the very least. So we examined our logic model. It had seemed unassailable before. We said to ourselves, if people have access to ownership of assets, a home, an education, a bank account, then they will have a reliable path out of poverty. And that if we help them make these things available, that would, you know, that would be a good thing. You know, and we said to ourselves, well, we needed to examine all of those assumptions that were behind the logic model. That in fact, there was expansion in the economy, but it was not shared. And that there was actually increasing income inequality. And this wasn't just us complaining, this was very based in facts. Even a rather hair-raising report from McKinsey Global talking about the kind of continuing expansion of income inequality here as well as around the globe in other developed economies. More jobs for everyone, owning a home, the gateway to prosperity. Well, actually, owning a home ended up, and it was a prime strategy of the Heron Foundation, being an unwitting way that in many cases, very poor people lost everything, all the progress they had made. This was not obviously intentional, but this is in fact what happened. And this was, there were also hair-raising statistics about who bore the brunt of that asset, that loss of asset value, and that loss of wealth when the economy collapsed. So that was counter to our most cherished assumptions. The notion that there are ever-escalating rewards for education. Actually, you know, just having a high school diploma didn't actually get you where you needed to go. You needed something different. And that was starting to be less of a shoe-in. You know, you do your work, you follow this path, and you will get there. That education is much more iffy as an asset than it one time was. And that there is a poverty among only a small minority, the small minority starting to get larger, and it's including all sorts of people we never thought we'd see in poverty, like school teachers, policemen, factory managers, skilled workers, and so on. So all of that, deeply sobering to us, deeply sobering. And we came to the conclusion that fixed assets are good, but without income, without reliable income that might come from a reliable job, they were a kind of a fool's errand. And owning a home if you don't have a job. This is a massive dumb moment for the strategy consultant, of course, but at any rate, that we're not concerned with a system. That we are concerned with a system, not a subsystem. In other words, it's not about the margins of the system, it's about the system itself. That the notion that if poverty is marginal, we're dealing with just a small minority that just needs a hand up to get into the mainstream and then it's going to be fine. As opposed to the system itself has gone into a place where we need a rethink here. And we concluded that it's the system, not the margins. And the final thing we concluded was that financial and social risk, to get back to our theme du jour, were equal and convergent. That they could not, in fact, be made into neat little packages on either side of a bright line. And this is not a terrifically earth-shattering finding. So wonderful. What does a yes?
Could you say what do you mean when you say social risk? I mean, I think financial risk seems a little more self-explanatory.
Losing your job and going into poverty.
That's that you would find that as a social risk rather than a financial risk.
Well, it's sort of
Oh,
both.
okay. Okay, I see.
The notion that you can kind of solve the poverty over here and, go on, running the financial system over there, as I say, it's a dumb moment. Of course, it's never been not equal. And in fact, of course, being, so we said to ourselves, what does a $250 million foundation do about this? Okay, so this is true, but so what? And of course, we called in two more consultants whom you may recognize, and they agreed on 3 guiding principles that would allow the foundation to reduce risk of failure in its social mission in the future. Well, the first 2 were financial consultants, and they agreed. Karl Marx and Adam Smith, of course, agreed that all capital should go to mission. They come from slightly different places, but at the end of the day, moral capitalism and capital for mission from a socialist point of view have more in common than they have not in common. And that it's not enough to just do 5 or 6% of the residual from one's endowment for mission. That in fact the foundation felt it needed, given the urgency and the need to mitigate social risk, it needed to do 100% of its endowment focused on mission. Cross asset classes, this is the whole economy, this is not just the goody part of the economy, this is the whole economy. And that we should go beyond financial capital to intellectual and social capital, which is, sort of a long-standing strategy at any rate. So that was one piece of the puzzle. So the foundation has made that decision. And we asked ourselves, why would a philanthropic institution want to do anything else? Our new lens would be, why would any work of a philanthropic institution not be for mission? That the whole idea of separating the two is kind of artificial. The second kind of guiding principle to mitigate risk of failure is to basically practice enterprise finance. And by that I mean money is a tool. It can be wielded well and it can be wielded poorly. It can be wielded poorly by professionals. It can be wielded well by some amateurs. But it's a tool. And you can't just use, there is a financial role one takes on. You can be a capital provider. That's different from being a buyer of services, for example. 2 very distinct financial roles. We have made the decision that we are industry and tax status agnostic in the way we wield our capital. That is, we're saying to ourselves, what's the best use of a Heron Foundation dollar to fulfill mission? How will we get jobs done with this dollar? If our lens and our new mission is to help build employment, help expand opportunity in the economy, maybe it's a private equity deal. It is an entire range of things we could do. And that we would embrace this financial role as a capital provider. If that's going to be our tool, then we're going to do it right. And if we are going to invest in enterprises, we're going to be savvy about how to invest in those enterprises to help them grow and within the context of their markets. And that question, again, is what is the best use of a Heron dollar? And then the third is really to say we need to change the entire operating context of the foundation itself. Because we can't get this done without a fairly extreme culture change. And so we've basically united our both staffs, the grant staff and the investment staff. We don't have any investment staff and grant staff. We just have a capital deployment staff that deploys capital for mission. And together develops plans, looks at the market, and makes investments. And in that situation, what we're saying is, how can the foundation wield its money with the most skill for one purpose? How do we get those dollars out the door? One of the three things that implies for us, that one office for capital deployment, is also that we have a vested interest in sharing with the rest of the world, that we see ourselves within a larger market. That's one thing that if you're thinking about deploying capital, you do. You don't say you are in a terrarium with a glass dome over it. You and your grantees are doing a great job together. But in fact, you're saying, we want to make this grantee whole, or we want to make this grantee or this investee, we want them to grow, let's say. What does their market look like? Who are their other investors? Where is their revenue coming from? If there's revenue, capital will follow. And the big problem in the environment today is the revenue is uncertain, of course. And finally, of course, then we have mission first and then compliance. We will comply with the laws, the IRS regulations, whatever prudent man regulations there may be that govern foundations. But we do that after we've decided what kind of mission path we want to take. We don't do that as a business model, which is the way most foundations actually chart their course. They say we need to comply with the IRS, and then we need to figure out how we're going to fulfill our mission as opposed to the opposite. So we're just turning that slightly on its head. Okay. So, to summarize, here are from the tactical starting place of the evolution of the foundation strategy, said to ourselves, okay, if poverty is structural, not marginal, then access strategy is not enough. And that if asset acquisition is an unreliable route to prosperity, then reliable income is the thing we should be after, not asset ownership. If reliable work and livelihoods are the key to social benefits, that without them there's a witch's brew of social ills that beset individuals, families, communities, then we want to invest financial and other capital to build jobs and social equity. That's our strategy. And if there's a system breakdown, if the whole system isn't working, then we want to go for system change. What that means to our look at risk is that we express our logics differently with relationship to risks. That from financial risk being most important and kind of overriding lots of decisions, we went to mission risk is as important as financial risk, and they need to be looked at together. From an emphasis on capital preservation, which tends to pervade foundations and their investment decisions, we would go to an emphasis on capital deployment. And from a mission and non-mission assets, both in a foundation, we would say to ourselves, we're going to a place where we can say, we only have mission assets. We don't have non-mission assets. Even if it's a public company, we'll look at it through that lens. And finally, should understand that reconciling financing and social impacting practice is, of course, an experiment. We're making some progress. But we are going to unify the financial and social leverage to change the world for the better. Finance, leverage, and impact working as one. Thank you very much. And I would be happy to share it. But yes.
Fundamentally, so, okay, you've got a $250 million property endowment,
yep.
Right? Your goal is to obviously generate, in the past, has been to generate income off of this endowment, which you then employ in programs. Are you saying you came in with this change in strategy, you then said, the $250 million, that yes, it's got to be sustained, we've got to preserve our capital, but we are going to change what those investments are so that the investments are consistent with our overall mission, although obviously the risk profile has to be different. If that is indeed true, then how much did your portfolio change And did your investments change?
We just made this decision. We think it's going to take 3 to 5 years minimum to
report.
Yeah, we have fairly big holdings in private equity. We have fairly, I mean, and so all of those, that has to be a conversion. But that's something we are modeling.
But am I correct?
But you're correct.
That
Yes.
is exactly the strategy.
Yes.
Instead
And
of taking a financial asset and say we're going to be in, a Dow Jones or whatever, you are now looking at every financial investment and
Yes.
saying it really has to have a double bottom line.
Exactly. Yeah. And so do our nonprofit assets. And those are, we'll make investments as a capital investor in those, probably in groups because we don't have enough money all by ourselves to actually, our $10 to $15 million grant budget a year is not going to take anybody up a big growth curve. It's more like, we need 10 to 20 a pop. And there needs to be syndication behaviors in the field. So we're going to lead capital syndications for nonprofits as part of what we do to build their strength. It's just that the financial returns will be returned to the nonprofit rather than to be distributed to individual investors.
Yeah, so how do you balance the notion of preservation of capital versus spending down or some of the other strategies?
We get some really smart financial modelers in the room because we need growth just as much as we need income. We can use PRIs, which are right now a very elastic kind of management tool to assure liquidity. We've been talking about syndications to CDFIs and a variety of other things. But there's ways to start working around that. But that is a key question, is that if you invest in growth so that we assume that we want to stay in business as long as there's going to be poverty in the country. Well, that sadly is not something that we can see an end to right off the bat. So how do you assure that you grow your assets at the same time as you're providing income to fulfill your IRS needs?
Yes. Given that, do you have any sense yet on how it's going to change your portfolio asset allocation in traditional ways? I'm just curious because that's what, that asset allocation to ensure growth. So that
we have to have a sharpened view of public equities because they provide both liquidity and growth. So they're a sort of a magic bullet in a way. What we do now is we have something called the Community Investment Index, which is a kind of a screen. We've developed this kind of intellectual property that screens public companies, Fortune 500 companies, based on their relationship to their communities. We're kind of on whether that we need to do a refresh of that. But the idea of looking at public companies that way, I think, is exactly what we need to do with a little more rigor.
Do you think that the allocation to public companies is actually going to go down there to ensure that you're meeting your mission? Do you feel?
I don't know. That's a financial modeling question, and that's a question for performance too. Because we're also, if you think about the foundation as enterprise and have performance metrics, quarter by quarter, just the way you do in an actual business, and make decisions that way rather than docket-wise and sort of know what your give-out does, your budget's going to be at the beginning of the year. It changes the possible answers to that question, and it makes it more forward-leaning and more entrepreneurial. Yes?
You mentioned being industry and tax status agnostic, and I'm wondering if that's possible for nonprofits that are not self-financing. So for nonprofits that rely on donor funds to sustain themselves, is it still possible?
So I have a very strong opinion about fundraising, which is it's a business line. And so, there's a kind of a slightly, I think, overbearing fantasy that self-sufficiency equals, for a not-for-profit, equals 100% earned income from some source. And that if you scale yourself and you get big enough, the heavens will open, the angels will sing, you won't have to fundraise anymore. Well, has Duke stopped fundraising? Last time I checked. You know, Harvard has 2,000 people in that line of business, okay? This is not, I mean, nonprofits that scale their red ink too. And I'm here to tell you. And what you do is you actually provide capital to populate that line of business without apology. And you say, okay, we know if we're going to grow, we're going to have more red ink, but it's worth it from a mission point of view, so we're going to actually put 5 people in the development department, not that student intern plus half the assistant director's time, right? So, yes, in the back.
How often do you plan on reviewing the mission of the organization, and how data-driven is that analysis? The reason I ask is, so I worked at an asset-building nonprofit, and basically, everyone kind of, as you said, thought the key was home ownership, essentially until financial.
It wasn't, yeah.
And so it was kind of a crisis that caused that reevaluation.
Yeah.
So I guess really the question is, how proactive does the organization plan on being
Yeah.
data-driven?
It's a fabulous question. So I have a fantasy about metrics, which is really, it's about data, because I think the sector, the kind of, it's not the nonprofit sector, it's actually the kind of broad swath of enterprise that does social good. And that's a very broad swath, I would submit. There's more social enterprise than anti-social enterprise, at least so far. And I would say that if you start getting really good comparable data, and there's an organization called Co-op Metrics, for example, that collects that. There have actually been instances in the housing industry and groceries and other places where you can get that. And it doesn't have to be about nonprofits. It can be about any provider. And you start looking across the sector at how enterprise is making a difference. Then it informs your investment choices in a very different way. Then you start getting outside of what I like to call our terrarium, where it's us and the organization, and we're doing well, and so, poor people must be doing well. And you start really pushing yourself to ask those questions in real time. That doesn't mean that, we've got such a broad strategy. If the heavens opened and there was full employment, I guess we might modify it to say, how do we keep it that way, right? But it's a great question on how do you know you're succeeding, absolutely. I'm just going to go over to this side of the room because I know
I was just wondering, sort of along the same lines of mission, when you're thinking about reallocating some of your assets to more mission-driven organizations, I'm wondering how loosely you're defining mission. I mean, are you looking at sort of any organization that maybe has some double bottom line principles in place, or are you looking specifically at organizations that build assets as a way of poverty alleviation?
well, we're not looking at the build asset. So intentionality, there's a huge conversation about this, and it's a great question. And we can't say that we have a completely baked theory of how you tell if an organization is actually, kind of contributing to the shared value of society, which is what you come to. There's a lot of controversy over whether what's called intentionality is important. Did they mean to do something good? Did they set up to be a social enterprise or a B Corp or whatever it is? So no matter how poorly they treat their employees or whatever it is they do, or how little social value they provide, they meant to do a good job. Or conversely, there's a guy who has the gas station on the corner and sponsors a little league team and is a mensch and whatever it is in small town Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, where I happen to live. Is he a social enterprise? Is he a contributing value? Yeah. And so there's a lot of gray there. What our kind of theory we're starting with, and we don't know where we're going to actually end, but there has to be some rigor for sure, because otherwise it just goes to mush very fast. Is that there's a real kind of that by putting some comparable numbers out there, financial numbers, employment numbers, very simple capacity metrics that people already keep, outliers will start appearing. And those outliers will, pay way less than the minimum wage, or they will get very, very poor outcomes, or have very poor production in terms of, the numbers of kids they have in school, or they will have huge layoffs. I mean, you have these Bloomberg databases; they're just incredibly detailed on what's out there from the point of view of enterprise. I think also, just in constructing the portfolio, there's going to be, kind of high definition organizations that are bullseyes, and I could define them right now, and then there'll be kind of soft focus, they're good companies compared to all their peers, but, maybe not on the entire scale of goodness and badness. Yes?
But at the end of the day, to these companies, you will give a credit or a loan more cheaper, or you will give a loan to someone who banks really don't serve. What is the difference between your institution, even if it's an NGO or other figure, and a bank?
Right. The bank doesn't keep tabs on whether it's doing social good or not. It actually mostly keeps it, although some are starting to do that by regulation. They have for a while with the CRA, but that's a separate issue.
But cheaper, for example?
Not necessarily. I think in our case, we are a capital provider, which means that we are financing a change for the good. We are either a capital provider, or in the case of equity, we are a concerned owner. But in the case of nonprofits or small businesses, we will come in as part of providers of capital who will improve the capacity of those organizations to do what they do. And those are organizations that keep metrics on their social impact. We will not be the only provider of capital, and we'll expect some sort of return. It's not necessarily going to be the absolute highest return, but it certainly will be enough of a return that we will live to fight another day, and that we fund our grant budget. Remember, the Heron Foundation has 40% of its assets in mission-related and program-related investments now. Large proportion of private equity, for community development, private equity, large proportion of bonds. They're completely defensively social investments. I don't think, lower interest is moot in this interest environment. It's irrelevant. And capital, for that matter, is pretty much moot because it's reliable revenue we're looking at. Reliable revenue is what we need. There's capital looking around for a place to go, but not necessarily what bankers want to see, which is reliable revenue. We may be able to play a role in that, kind of taking more risk point in place.
Well, Clara, let me tease that out a little bit with you. With 40% of the endowment invested in some form of mission-related activity, already that's a big separated from Heron and virtually every other foundation on the block. There often is the question that if you wanted to do 100%, you can't find the deals. That the stuff out there to provide enough reliable income for the foundation to keep its motors running at all times just isn't there, or isn't there enough yet. How do you play with that idea? I think Kathy was getting at it, and a few of us were, so that you can fulfill that mission with enough reliable dollars to go ahead.
Yeah, it's funny because that's what the large foundations say. Right. Well, it's easy for you guys to do this because you're small, but we would have to find really, a lot of these spindly little deals. But I would submit that they're not just spindly little deals. There are some larger deals. There is some interesting private equity. There is some generation capital management is emerging that does public companies. I think that if you task investment professionals with finding good deals, that fill this a certain kind of a template, they will go forth and find them. And if capital is available for organizations that have certain characteristics, they will start changing their behavior. And I don't think that saying, well, we can't find deals is I think it's hard and I think it's expensive. And one of the reasons there is development finance is that on one end of the spectrum, it's very costly and very complex in relationship to the revenue you earn on whatever it is, whether it's a loan or a private equity deal or anything else. And so that's why banks don't want to do that stuff. But that's not the entire range of commerce that's available in the social sector. In the front row.
I had a question. You mentioned your grants budget. So I'm wondering, will you still have a grants budget, or will you think of all of your assets as being put in?
Well, both. We
will have grants.
Yes, I mean, we still have to fulfill IRS regulations, so 5% has to go to not-for-profits, et cetera. And we are probably going to do bigger chunks for growth or change in a capital, as capital is actually to attract more revenue, is the kind of use of capital as a tool, as opposed to revenue, which are two very different things. So that's how we're looking at it. So we'll have longer lead time, we'll have more preparedness grants going out in small chunks, but then we'll deal with a smaller number of larger grants to nonprofits that have those kinds of that kind of promise. Yes.
So it sounds like a lot of our questions are dealing with how you preserve your livelihood as well as invest. My question is, so if you think that to solve the problem of poverty is that there is renewable or dependable, whatever the word was, you said income,
Yeah.
then how are you going to measure your impact and your outcome in that way?
What we would like to do is to start with what the organizations in the field need to measure to be successful. We have made the decision to get all of the reporting outside of the foundation. We've stopped actually asking grantees for reports because we're not using them, and we think they add transaction cost and don't add much value to anybody's life. And instead, what we're trying to get them to do is to report to some sort of common data platform where we will pull the data and use it and analyze it ourselves and use it for our own purposes. That will involve, so there's sort of individual enterprises are managing themselves and using data, and they're telling us what they need. Then the next level is really kind of field-wide or industry-wide. So then we can compare them with their peers. Are they onto something? Are they growing faster? Are they getting better results? But that's not really their job. That's not in their band of control. And then the next level is geographically. If, for example, we're interested in Buffalo, New York, what's happening in Buffalo in the broader economy? And are these, how do we help lift all boats? How do we take the data we have collected on these organizations and with them help everybody in that cohort actually go up the ladder? Because in a way, I mean, we're not trying to create stars and point to them. That will not change the economy. That will not get us where we want to go. What we really want to do is for everybody to learn from each other and rise and do a better job. So the question, so we don't think of collecting results as compliance. We think of it as informative, as empowering and informative for the entire field. We put ourselves on the same side of the table as the grantees from the point of view of how do we get better results. So, and that in a way is around the ethics of being a capital provider, being an equity holder, is that you want that organization to succeed, as you do if you buy from them because you want them to be there again to get
And then it becomes a model for other organizations who have a similar mission.
We are hoping, we think that data shared that actually means something to managers is empowering. We think that data that is published by one foundation to point to its own success is interesting, but not empowering to a large number of people in the field. Having been one of those people in the field, I can say most of us said, well, give us the money, we'll do that too. You know, I mean, it's sort of, but what we want to do is to make things happen that can happen without us. Right? So that's part of it. And what providing capital with a group of other foundations over time and then exiting does is allow us to live it, to fight another day.
So I have a follow-up.
Okay.
You guys don't mind? So, timeline-wise, what are you thinking?
I don't know. It's hard. I mean, converting the portfolio 3 to 5 years. I mean, just pragmatically. Getting some sort of data platform and working with the folks that are still already in the field to figure out what that might look like without being redundant. 2 to 3 years minimum. You know, it took us a long time to get here. We're not going to get out of it quickly. Getting other foundations interested in doing things with us, that's happening rather quickly. If we do a stupid job, that'll unravel pretty quickly too. I realize that.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Who's coming aboard? How they're coming aboard?
Well, what we're doing, here's one deal we're working on. I mean, an example of an organization. I don't know if any of you know something called Paraprofessional Healthcare Institute. It's in the South Bronx in New York City. It's the top company. It's a 3-company organization. The top company is a nonprofit. It does advocacy and it does training of home health attendants. It has 2 subcorps, one of them being the largest cooperative, I think, certainly in New York State, maybe in the country, of home health workers, mainly African American and Latino women, and it's a for-profit co-op. They get dividends, or they get whatever it is, they get shares. They are trained, they get full benefits, they get above minimum wage jobs, thanks partly to the advocacy of the top company that got that legislation passed in New York State. Home attendants weren't covered by minimum wage laws last year. They get regular work, which is really rare in the home attendant business. It's very common that you get, sort of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the morning, but then it's hard to get anything else. But they get pretty filled-in schedules, which adds up to livelihood. So that's that side. The other side of the company is a managed care outfit insurance company. Because of changes in the health laws, they're about to double in size. And in order to keep fidelity to this model, this top, kind of nonprofit has to have what we call growth capital. It has to have growth capital because it needs to change its business model. It needs to invest in new ways of doing things. Some of the folks coming in are going to be Medicare as well as Medicaid. They've almost exclusively dealt with Medicaid patients. Very different population. They need to learn new things and refresh their program platform. All of this, so we're pulling together a group of their fans, which is a very large club. Because they're such a strong earned income model, they haven't built any kind of fundraising capacity. And because they serve the poor, they generally do not have access to individual contributions. Individual contributions are rarely available to low-income causes. Most people give to their alma maters and their hospitals, grateful patients and grateful alums, and to their houses of worship. So here's a challenge. We want to invent a capital campaign of a different type. We want to try to pull in individuals which we think will be interested in this and build that kind of armature to actually pay for their capital as they get bigger and stronger. And we want to help fund their growth given their challenges right now. We think they probably need $20 million, $10 million of which should be what we call philanthropic equity, which is grants that are paying for the deficits on the way to a sustainable business model of a higher quality. So that's an example. I could name all of the things. You name every foundation in New York City and you'll get the list of those interested. But we're especially interested in trying to get Robin Hood in the door. John Hartford is already standing up and raising its hand. I mean, bunches of others. Yes, you haven't spoken.
So I wondered how far you might see this going when you're talking about investing in and upgrading things that are already there, and there is quite a bit of innovation in doing that. But I wondered about things that aren't there. I mean, perhaps one of the reasons, if you look back to the mission, one of the underlying reasons for some of the poverty and problems in our society are because there are not institutions and functions that are there to do everything. If you're going to, just from a capitalist point of view, there's a lot more risk in starting something completely new than in incrementally changing or upgrading something that exists. And so I wondered, are you all willing
Absolutely.
to?
We are not willing. We're very clear on that. That's not our financial role now. But there are folks who are willing, whom we want to work with in a kind of a supply chain. So there are organizations like in New York, there are venture capital, kind of philanthropic venture capital funds. There are friends and family funds. There are a variety of places that folks can go if they're brand new entrepreneurs. It's not easy, and it's highly risky.
Well, I was thinking of something a little bigger scale. Like, for example, all the work on, there are a lot of associations, say, between climate change and poverty. And most of the work on climate change in the U.S. with the coal industry has been at the smokestack end of things, and getting them to change, what they're burning in those smokestacks or how they burn it. What would it take to go to the people whose lives, whether they're financially poor or poor in other ways, who mine coal, to make them want to have other sorts of jobs in industries that would be big? And if people didn't want to mine coal in the U.S. anymore, now that would have a big impact on climate change and affect the poverty of the people who live there. But somebody has to get some big deal together to make how that would be. And so
getting a big deal together is not what we do. We finance the brilliant people who get those big deals together. And we finance them, we are, by choice at this point in our lives, because we want to add jobs, right? So startup phase, you add jobs, you might add jobs pretty fast, but it's so risky. If we can find an organization that is kind of coming out of its early stage, it has a proof of business and it has a proof of concept, and it's starting to scale up, we think that the value add for our dollars invested will be higher in that phase of the business development than at the very early stage. And in your case, it sounds like you have special knowledge of that environment and that market. So that would be a terrific job for you, right? Not you, because you've had wonderful questions. I'm asking the gentleman next to you.
I was wondering if what your journey includes working at all with the B Company movement.
Well, I know those guys. I keep in touch with them. I'm not entirely sure yet what problem it solves, although I've heard that they do some good stuff. I mean, I like them, and I think it's wonderful energy. I'm not entirely sure what problem it's solving, and I'm a little kind of leery about certifying good. Right? Does this mean everybody else is bad? Does this mean, okay, these guys get to be good and all the rest of you get to misbehave as much as you want? or what? I mean, so I'm cautiously supportive of the energy. I'm not quite sure about practicality yet, but they've done a lot of terrific stuff. I mean, they're out there beating the drum for the ideas that I also hold dear. So, yes, in front of them.
Given the change in the strategy and the mission on the outside, are you doing any internal staff restructuring or realignment in-house?
Ouch. Well, it's interesting because Heron's small, of course. You can't have. I think there were 12 people when I came, and many of them were actually part-time kind of consultants doing things outside. We have radically changed the kind of work we do. We don't have nearly as many grants, so there just wasn't as much work for the consultants. So they sort of went away. Our investment officer got a terrific job as the CEO of GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, right? And a couple of program officers just left of their own volition because they liked being program officers. And this was clearly not going to be that anymore. So we are now down to 6. We just hired a 7th, and we're building back up. But in a big foundation, that would be, and I know it is because I'm working with a couple of big foundations and talking to their boards and staff. Everybody always says, oh, it's the investment guys who are guarding the endowment and they don't want anything to do with it. Well, it's also the program officers who are saying, I didn't come to a foundation to do to do banking, etc. So it's both sides are kind of squaring off. And if you have a lot of people working at the foundation, it's a much thornier issue than it has been at Heron. But there has been a culture change, massive. Yes,
in your earlier definition of mission, I think the word communities.
Yes.
In your new talk, where does place?
It's still there in the mission. I was distracted by Ed.
He's very distracted.
But yes, people and communities help themselves out of poverty. And that's, the more we see, the more, I think it's both a key and a real investment opportunity. So there are some one of the things, the bad kind of narratives is that we have a choice between either, this kind of awful situation where to compete in a global economy, we have to look like a country that would have to look like a country that has very deep poverty that we're competing against, and we have to lower wages and people have to go into that world. And on the other end of the spectrum, we're just going to have the government, provide lots and lots of aid to the increasing number of poor people. And I think that there is a creative middle. And I think that creative middle is where most of the investment opportunity is. And it's something that most banks are really ill-equipped to address. And that middle is there are kind of very interesting initiatives happening in places like Buffalo or Cleveland, or these anchor institution ideas and similar kinds of things. People starting artisanal goat farms in the Hudson Valley. That's sort of silly, but it's remarkable how much activity there is that's kind of saying, okay, well, it's not working, we're going to try something different. That's of people who are entrepreneurial, who are just kind of starting to try stuff. And I think that is an investment opportunity, and I think that's about community. Very profoundly, yes.
I'm intrigued with the data platform. Can you maybe play that out a little bit, like with the paraprofessionals group, so you all make a big investment there and...
We're looking, so they already have metrics. Their regulators get metrics from them. Robin gets metrics from them. The last thing we're going to do is have new metrics. So what we're trying to do is to create an industry group on home care for co-op metrics, for example, because it is a co-op, it's already kind of in that crew, and to look across its peers at who's doing best. I mean, they may end up, their metrics are very fine in their first quartile in kind of clinical results and patient satisfaction and all those other things. We'd like to see what they are in the enterprise side, lined up with them. So we're all looking at how do you float those votes up, so that the state of New York looks at that, so that, insurance companies look at that, whoever it is. So we're trying to make improvements to the systems that are self-powered. And part of what got me on this idea was the head of there are the various trade associations of co-ops. For example, the grocers have a big vertical in the co-op metrics kind of data platform. And just by reporting their numbers in and looking across at other peers, they improve their results 10% year over year, just by seeing what other people are doing and asking them at conferences, well, how do you do that? And the transparency meant that during the financial crisis, when the banks cut off their credit lines, they actually financed each other's receivables or payables, and which got them all through together. So there's lots of, when you talk about community, there's lots of opportunity for transparency and data to empower and inform and bring us all up the curve, as opposed to only control and kind of compliance mechanism, which is important too. But that's the vision for we've got a bunch of kind of new folks in the first cohort that include PHI, but also include some other types of organizations, a housing organization and others.
So the data platforms would be sectoral.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
It looks like that's the way to do it. I mean, and in the future, perhaps looking at what the for-profits do and what the trade-offs are and what we can learn from that and pay from a different business model. But there is data that goes across kind of legal forms of business, as they say. It's, it has co-ops, it has S-corps, it has partnerships, it has sole proprietorships, it has public companies, and looks at data across those industry groups. And it's very interesting. And nonprofits and government. Each of those is an enterprise type. It's a different kind of tool.
Now, self-help has multiple databases that it produces or uses from the private sector as well as.
And then we also report to co-op,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
As part of the housing cohort. So that was the other part. That is the big nonprofit reporting cohort, and that was another great shining example, or at least reasonably shining example, of how folks can learn from each other and become enthusiastic about being empowered about data. Getting used to a new board, and had a different board than one that was very, very different kind of enterprise. Whenever you start a new job, you always go into it thinking, well, were they really serious about this? Because when I took the job, the question was, well, do you, why would you want to change your job? And I said, well, I'm not sure I do. If you want somebody to kind of make, keep the foundation on the same path and keep the trains running on time, I'm not your girl. I really do a terrible job doing something like that. But if you really are interested in seeing how the foundation as enterprise could be, at least have an alternative model, something slightly different, then I'd be interested in that job. And so they've been very much true to their word, if not running down the path faster than I am. So that's been, I was worried about that, but it has turned out to not.
And looking forward, what do you think is the marketplace ready for you? Or what are you finding that's squishy?
We can only go up. That is quite shiny. I mean, what's worrisome and what, is we just hired a good guy that has financial modeling experience, that math, lots of math, lots of big management, and it's finding a financial model and modeling financial results so that we can actually see if this dog can hunt, kind of. We don't think it's absolutely in the bag, that it's real easy to do this. We think it's really going to be hard. But we think any progress in that direction is the right thing to do. So maybe we find, okay, the max you can really do in this environment is 80%. Is that so awful? That's kind of nice. And that we change the nature of how Foundation thinks about its work. Is that so terrible? No. Or at least provide an alternate model. I don't think everybody has to do this. Yes. And then, maybe I'll go with you first.
Can I? So, a couple of things that you said struck me as being kind of intention.
Intention?
Intention.
Intention with one another. Okay.
And one is that you really want to focus on opportunities that have a very that are good bets in that they have good revenue streams that are reliable. The other one is that you want to find those opportunities that other people aren't finding, and other people aren't investing in, that they really need you. And it kind of strikes me, and I'm sure you've thought about this, so I'd love to hear the rationale, that if they have these great revenue streams, why are these other investors not finding them? I mean, it seems to me those kind of companies in this environment have lots of capital opportunities.
Well, we may find that. I have sort of two pieces of that puzzle. One of them being, in my past life, Nonprofit Finance Fund was like a little financial institution itself.
Oh, yeah.
Funded in large part by, and I founded it and ran it for 28 years.
So clearly you know all these things.
Well, I don't know all these things. I still don't think there's an obvious answer to your question, and that's in fact, the business we have chosen, in the words of the Godfather, is to look for these good deals that are, that the banks don't want, but
for some unknown reason.
Well, and they have a regulatory framework that we don't have. Although we do have prudent man standard, which is a separate issue, but we think we can do a workaround there. There's various pieces of the puzzle. We don't have bank regulators reading down our necks. And it's not just going to be debt, it's also equity. And it's also kind of investing alongside equity fund partners, sometimes with debt for equity companies, that creates a real opportunity. These are not necessarily ones that are out there. They might be going to banks, but they might not. That is kind of helping them. The banks usually don't like it because in some cases an early stage equity company has trouble figuring out the difference between the equity and the revenue. And so we might be able to lend, for example, in that kind of mushy area.
So your competitive advantage there, it sounds like there has to be some competitive advantage that you have to either currently have or be in the process of developing with your staff. Is that something you're working on?
It's one of these great paradoxes of being in the not-for-profit sector, where you are working all the time as an enterprise to put yourself out of business on some level. So the big victory would be, in fact, that all these deals disappear, that the banking sector is in there funding these companies that are doing amazing work in Appalachia or wherever it is, or providing employment in the Delta, in the Mississippi River Delta. So far, that's not a problem. And the reliable revenue, that is a problem. And being able to figure out where that exists, where there's not somebody, kind of standing in front of it saying, "Hi, I'm a capital source," that's going to be a challenge. There's no question about that.
Before you take another question, let me ask something that you haven't talked about before, and that's under the rubric of government. You don't have regulators hunting you down, making it more difficult, but in the rethinking of mission and what you're going to be doing, Have you spent much time, or what's your thinking about how you will engage state, local, and perhaps even federal government in assisting this mission focus to come true?
So government has a very pervasive and giant role, obviously. One of the key ones, and particularly in the nonprofit sector, but in both tax statuses, lots of what is financed by the not-for-profit or the social sector financing crew is actually government receivables. So the reliable revenue that's out there right now, or the maybe not so reliable revenue in many cases, is government or third-party payments. For example, with PHI, it's home care that is Medicare and Medicaid financed. So those are, so that is the income stream. I think if we looked behind the curtains at many for-profits in the defense industry, we would find a very similar situation. And we're traveling toward a kind of a cliff, or at least something that might look like a fiscal cliff for the federal government. So I think we have to be very, a little bit anxious about that. That said, if all of that, reliable revenue goes away tomorrow morning, we're in a much bigger pickle than the Heron Foundation can possibly do anything with. On the policy side, I think there's lots to be done. But we are tending, just because of resources, to leave that to the current professionals and look to working with local and state governments where we think the creativity and the opportunity actually lie right now. So, yes.
So if you found a Bloomberg or half dozen cities, and there are more than that, that are energetically looking to work in this sort of entrepreneurial way, opening up loan funds, et cetera, they would be pretty ideal colleagues and co-investors with you in some.
Yes, and also what we found is that anchor institutions such as institutions of higher learning or hospitals or whatever that have needs for food and laundry and a variety of other things. I mean, Cleveland has the Cleveland Clinic, which is becoming exhausted by the number of visits from foundations to find out what they're doing. But they're basically saying, why don't we turn our income stream, which is for, rather than buying, from California or wherever it is, let's buy from the folks right in Cleveland. And the reason they made this decision, the chief operating officer of the Cleveland Clinic is really clear about this. He has 1,000 jobs to fill, nurses, vacancies in his payroll, because he can't get nurses to come to Cleveland because they're afraid to walk through the parking lot. They are surrounded by a dangerous place. And so now the community foundation, the clinic, several big institutions in town are all coming together around this, and corporations, in fact, which to me, what a great opportunity. And some of it is probably government funded, but the government is part of this, but it's not the prime mover, it's not the only game in town. It's not people saying, come help us, it's everybody working together. Quite wonderful.
Yeah, it seems to me the very example that you're giving strikes at the dichotomy that you started with, which is doing good versus greedy capitalists. And that perhaps that is a myth that at least one author I'm aware traces back to our Puritan heritage in this country. And that really part of the issue is historically we haven't had the capacity, but perhaps we have increasing capacity to bring into the financial model externalities that are bad. So that if we, for example, took oil companies or coal, having grown up in West Virginia, and looked at what are the total societal costs and factored that into pricing mechanism in the marketplace, suddenly those investments don't look so good.
I think you're absolutely right, and my chairman would probably like to meet you, because he is very definitely down that path. Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like life cycle costing for everybody, right?
Right. So a leverage point becomes maybe in something you left out as one of the things that you were doing is in the political arena, because that is going to require substantive change of policy and legislation.
Yeah. It's daunting to array one's forces against those of oil or coal in the policy arena in Washington anyway, where a lot of that policy gets made. So, for example, the Kyoto, there was a presentation on the Kyoto agreements and, what happened to them and why we wouldn't ratify them at a philanthropy conference I went through in Aspen this summer. And a young man who had been a staff to the Natural Resources Defense Council or whoever was part of a coalition of environmental groups who were lobbying, he just put up one graph, and the budget of the environmental groups, $11 million. The budget of the others, $1 billion, almost $1 billion. It was just like, what are they actually using that money for? I mean, it was just amazing. So they were writing legislation, they'd have it on their desk the next day. It was on and on. So on the one hand, couldn't agree more. On the other hand, I'm hoping we can find some clever plan that will, whether it's, shame, the good old Puritan, guilt, fear, and shame, the tools in the Puritan tool chest, try to get corporations to want to actually embrace externalities as part of their business risk. I think it's happening in certain places. I mean, there was a presentation at this also same meeting about conflict minerals and how Intel Corporation was actually doing work in countries where they needed the minerals for the things they were manufacturing. They were doing work at the end of the supply chain to try to make sure that their buying of the conflict minerals doesn't wind up in the hands of people who are using them to fund wars. And so at any rate, there's a beginning of understanding that bigger picture on the part of corporations. But I think you're absolutely right. That's part of the deal. Why should we be paying the cost every single moment?
But it's not priced into the cost of gallon gas we pay at the pump.
Exactly. That's
For
right.
the purchase of product that is the end result of the supply chain that is creating economic, environmental havoc that now comes home to us.
I couldn't agree more.
Let's take two more questions, and if that's okay with you.
Yes, sure, of course.
No, I'm just wondering, so in an ideal world, ignoring the oil companies, ignoring the coal, what types of public policies would make your life easier as a mission-focused investor?
Let's see. Policies. Well, here's one for you. It would make the contracting regulations equal between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. Because if you have a government contract, it doesn't matter what your tax status is, you're treated exactly the same way. It's anticipated you'll be profitable, it's anticipated you'll be strong, it's anticipated you'll have stores of working capital. It would make a massive difference overnight in the performance of the sector. And that would be one. I would change the way the IRS forms 990 are structured, because they're just plain bad accounting, and they're a great potential form of shared metrics and shared information on finance, but it's undermined by the fact that it's so, it's just put together in a stupid way. That's a technical term. And they just, I actually became a member of FASB's committee, the nonprofit committee of FASB, because I felt so strongly about accounting. I would like my 7th grade math teacher to see me. That's all I wanted to know. But at any rate, so So there's lots of things on the accounting side. I would, this is not federal regulation, but I would pull capital out of the revenue stream. So nonprofits actually report all capital and revenue together as regular income, and it massively distorts their earnings. They'll look at their earnings and their financial health. So if we just did that one thing, it would make a huge difference. I mean, you can do it voluntarily, but it just should flood the balance sheet. It's, go on. Those are three possibilities.
Let's take these two. I think, Paul, new actor. And
I haven't even been looking at that one.
Her question made me think of our current obsession with closing loopholes, at least which loopholes might be closed. Do you think there's any possibility of some of the treatment of foundations being changed under a change of administration? And what are the implications? What are the implications of that?
Even tax policy?
Yeah, I think there is a chance, and I think that the foundation world is not actually being activist about thinking about sort of how to position itself. It's interesting because the foundation and the nonprofit, there's a whole range of different kinds of tax exempt entities, and each one has a different stake. And I think that the tone of foundations tends to be a little defensive and it's kind of explaining itself rather than, and it needs to be having other people explaining it. So I think we have a ways to go to preserve tax status. I do think, however, that the tax code could be used to help the foundation world be more activist in the way it thinks about its business model and does its work, for sure, without harming its kind of independence, which I think is a positive thing.
Why don't you, please?
I think the industries that you talked about seem to be low-hanging fruit relative to the fact that the ones that are reimbursed from Medicaid, they have some revenue streams, so you're talking about how to sort of help them shore up and have more capital so that their revenue streams are up. But I'm wondering about the next level of low-paying jobs in sectors that may not have as much data, such as restaurants. And I don't know how much data is there, but I know there's some restaurants that took their horn about paying living wages. And then there are others who really don't. And then there's some who have, undocumented who are working there under the cover and how much they're being paid. Who knows? So that seems to be a segment of society who are employed in all these food places and restaurants who are being underpaid and have less opportunity for coming out of poverty. And is there some way of looking at data? Is there some data?
I think so. I mean, I think that's exactly the way we should go. We're saying to ourselves, how do we seek exposure, as opposed to just sort of saying, y'all come and we'll, kind of randomly take whoever looks good.
Yeah.
How do we say we want to seek exposure in the XYZ industry because, and we're just doing that inquiry now. My impulse at the beginning is to take the things that produce jobs for low-income people that are reliable as quick as possible and that will hang in there. And that might preclude us from going deep into places where there needs to be a lot of reform right away. But the idea of a capital investor is you go into one industry, you may not stay there forever. So we expect to enlarge. We're also hoping other foundations will start looking at their work this way. And I think you're asking a fabulous question. I think that's exactly the right way to go about it. You can't say we've gotten very far.
And that's the policy around that, too,
yeah.
from a policy perspective.
Marty, you want to take this? Well, Clara, thank you. This is a whirlwind, enormously important stuff. And those of you who follow this overlapping world of business and philanthropy, or whatever, can see this constant interaction. I'm very happy you came. I'm very happy you came to hear Clara. And thank you. I want to make just two announcements. One is for those of you who have not been here before and would like to be on the mailing list so that you can know more about who's coming, and they're all fabulous. Get hold of me, edward.scoot@duke.edu, or Mary Collins, mary.collins@duke.edu. Give us your name so we can stay in touch with you. And it would be fun to have you here. The second is our next speaker is, in a way, a soulmate of yours, is Jeremy Nowak.
He's fabulous.
You can't
Absolutely
miss him. And in a way, I try to help build this semester, focusing on very critical, let's call them urban financial questions. Rip Rapson, who was here last time, essentially talked about the effort to rebuild Detroit. And for those of you who are here, it was really riveting. It was his third visit, and each 2 years he's given us a status report on what's been happening in Detroit. Clara has shown us a different angle into the job, the good and reliable jobs world, and lots of other things too, and financing it. So Jeremy has been, as Rip Rapson has been the motivating force in Detroit, Jeremy has done it in Philadelphia for a much longer time. He is the champion of the rebuilding of what is essentially an urban environment that has fallen to pieces, and has been the most powerful lender, funder, real estate developer, and all other things, data collector, that have made Philadelphia, kept Philadelphia from really crumbling in lots of ways. So he's just gone over to be head of the largest foundation in Philadelphia. It's a $2 billion foundation. And he's taking all of these skills and trying to work them from a different perch. He talks tough, but he is tough. So I think if you folks would like to see another angle to how we are doing, how we collectively have to do our work, come in here, Jeremy, just as you came to hear Clara. Thank you on behalf of the group. It was great.